Why, after Shelley's death, did Mary really refashion Shelley's image as the solitary romantic genius when she had herself been part of, so intimately connected with this circle and benefited from and contributed to this kind of collaboration and creativity? Was that the only way in which she could isolate and accentuate his genius posthumously?
That's certainly something she was very concerned about doing. Partly it happens, though, because of the figure of Leigh Hunt. Because after Shelley's death, Leigh Hunt and Mary Shelley engaged in something of a battle about who should be the keeper of the flame, about who has the right to shape Shelley's posthumous legacy. Hunt is absolutely devoted to Shelley and devastated by his death. And he begins to write a series of autobiographical accounts in which he positions Shelley as his friend and in which he positions Shelley as part of his world. And in 1828, he publishes the most extensive of those accounts, which is a book called Lord Byron and Some of His Contemporaries. The problem is, Hunt is in that fantastic read about Byron, with whom he's fallen out after Shelley's death. And he's absolutely savaged by the critics. They just cannot believe that he could be so vulgar as to criticise someone who's dead and an aristocrat. So Hunt therefore really becomes tainted goods. And Mary Shelley is absolutely determined to make Shelley into a genius, that people should realise Shelley is a genius, for two reasons. One, because she's devoted to his memory, and she feels guilt about their last few weeks and months together, and she's determined to sort of make reparations to him by celebrating his poetry. And secondly, because she has to survive. She's living on very little money, she has a child to bring up. Her survival is dependent on being able to write and to rehabilitate her own reputation and the name of Shelley, and being able to throw off the sort of scandalous elements of her own past. So the way to strip Shelley of a problematic sociable context because of Hunt and a political context and a religious context because of the atheism is just to sort of distance him from all that and present him as a man who is very concerned about the well-being of his fellow men, but is somehow slightly removed from them, too clever for them. So it comes out of these twin impulses, I think.
I want to come back to Claire Clairmont, whom you've talked a little bit about before, because she, in many ways, is pivotal and a fascinating figure. From what you were saying before and from the way you present the book, she was much more than a victim. Some of the other women in the book you might, I suppose, characterise as victims. Their agency and their ability to influence their own fates were limited. But she's quite different from that, isn't she?
She is, and she has a very, very strong sense of how she wants her own life to be told and how she wants her own life to be seen. And one of the things I became very interested in was in the way in which, although she doesn't write long autobiographical things in her old age, you can still sort of construct what Claire's memoir might have looked like, because she talks to Edward Silsby and she writes long letters to people about her past. She clearly has a very complicated reaction with her past, partly because she's absolutely clear that Shelley and Mary and Byron are sort of they're the most important people and the central events of her life, that they are the major thing about her history. She understands that. But she also understands, because she experiences it, how dangerous that is. So when in 1826 she's working as a governess in Moscow, when it's found out that she's related to the Shelleys and the Godwins, she loses her job. So she really understands what it's like to be tainted by one's past. And of course she has an illegitimate daughter by Byron, Allegra, who dies aged 5 in a convent. So Claire never forgives Byron for the sort of destruction he causes in her life. And one of the things I found while I was writing the book was a fragment of memoir which hasn't been published before and which is in the book, in which she describes Shelley and Byron as monsters and tigers and monsters of lying, meanness, treachery and cruelty. And it's striking that she should be rude about Shelley, because although she's very rude about Byron, she's not really rude about Shelley anywhere else. And not only is she rude about Shelley in that bit of autobiography, she's rude about Shelley in his own language. She takes the language of the marriage note to Queen Mab and she turns it against him to destroy this sort of ideal of free love. So she's a very intriguing character, but I didn't quite fall for her. Some biographers have said they fell for her. Richard Holmes says at one point, I fell in love with Claire Clairmont. I did, perhaps because I'm an older sister, I had a slightly more complicated relationship with her. I think she's a fascinating character, but you can really see how disruptive a presence she was in the Shelleys' lives too.
With a biography of a single person, of course, the death, I suppose, marks the end of the main story. But how, when you're writing a group biography, how do you know when your story, as it were, has reached its conclusion?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's one I really struggled with how to end. But I felt like I always wanted to tell the story of what happens to the group, because the group really has, it forms and then it is, but there is also a story about what happens to it in popular imagination. And I wanted to try and understand why it is that Hunt's vision of a sort of sociable romanticism has disappeared so completely from our popular consciousness. And so that's really where I felt I wanted to end the story, that the story of the group doesn't end with death of Shelley or Keats or Byron. It ends at the point at which it comes apart in the popular imagination. So the final section of the book is about what happens after the deaths of Shelley and Keats, and it's about how the people who are left from the kind of ash cast of history, particularly the women, are sort of try and remake their lives and try and come to terms with their own complicated pasts.
Daisy Hay. Young Romantics, The Shelleys, Byron and Other Tangled Lives is out now in hardback. Full details and ordering information are available on the Blackwell online website at blackwell.co.uk. That's all for this edition of the Blackwell Online podcast. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.